Welcome, Aisha and Dean. To say it's an honor, it's truly an understatement. I'm so thankful for your time. So, how are you doing today?
Very well. Thank you so much for having us, Luca. It's so wonderful to be connected with you. I feel like we know you already. Just following you on Instagram. It's funny, these Instagram friends become almost a part of your circle. And we've really enjoyed the content that you put out. And we so appreciate your evidence based and scientific approach. So thank you for everything you're doing. And thank you for having us here.
I would like to start with some basics because we hear terms like dementia, Alzheimer, quite thrown out a lot nowadays, but I never or very rarely see them kind of like define what it truly means to have dementia or Alzheimer's. Let's just say I have dementia or Alzheimer, and I'm asking you, can you please explain to me what's happening in the brain in very simple terms, which is not easy to.
That's a very important place to start. Dementia is the umbrella category, like cancer. There is not one type of cancer. There are many types of cancer. There's not one type of dementia. There are many types of dementias. One of the main types, and one that actually constitutes about 70 to 80% of all dementias, is Alzheimer's. But there are other types of dementias as well. There's frontotemporal lobe dementia, there's Lewy body dementia, there's Parkinson's dementia, there's vascular dementia, there's Huntington's dementia, metabolic dementias, on and on and on and on. But the main big category is Alzheimer's. What makes dementia? When person's cognitive capacity declines to the point where they can't do one of their daily activities, such as driving or finances or cooking or making phone calls, what they call instrumental activities, substantive activities, then by definition it's dementia. Yeah, you can do neuropsychological testing and all of that, but this is actually a good start. When people are having difficulty with things that they shouldn't have, like that they've done for many years, driving, finance, not because they're distracted for a week, not because they're depressed, but because it's a consistent pattern, that's dementia. Now, what makes Alzheimer's unique? Alzheimer's, like we said, have a significant decline in short-term memory more than long-term memory at the beginning. But later on, it starts encompassing all of the brain. And that's why later on, all the dementias start looking the same because they all take all of the brain. But at the beginning, it distinguishes them. Alzheimer's is short-term memory, disproportionate to long-term memory. Frontotemporal lobe dementia is problem solving or language, disproportionate to memory and everything else. So that's how we distinguish these.
Basically, to put it in very simple terms, it's where exactly which area of your brain is affected. That's kind of like usually the disease that you're then going to diagnose it kind of like with.
Kind of, yes.
Perfect. Let's just say I'm now someone that is experiencing some memory loss. I guess to a certain extent, it's normal to have some types of memory loss, depending maybe some vitamin B12 deficiencies going on or other vitamins. Is there like a way for me to know, okay, now is the time to go to a doctor, or what kind of like type of diagnosis would you suggest to someone that is feeling like, hey, I feel like maybe something is going on here with my brain?
It's a great question, because we all experience some form of memory issues. If the memory issue is temporary, if the memory issue is not affecting daily life, you should be aware of it, keep a track of it, because at the end of the day, this is the signal that's coming from your most important organ. And here's a beautiful clue. You are your brain. You are your brain, and this brain actually gives you clues all the time. Whereas other organs don't give you a clue until it's late. When liver is dysfunctioning, by the time the SGOT, SGPT, all these chemicals go awry, by the time you turn yellow, or by the time there's esophageal problems or liver problems and all, it's a little down the stream. Or forget about pancreas, same thing. With brain, it gives you signals. Now, some of those signals are emotional. For example, a lot of times memory problems are because of focus problems. I say that focus is the gatekeeper of consciousness. If focus is affected, everything is affected. Because if focus is affected, memory is affected. If focus is affected, processing is affected. If focus is affected, language is affected. But what affects focus? Lots of things. Depression, anxiety, pain, sleeplessness, tension, sleep, lots of things that are not dementia related. Yeah, downstream, they might be causative of dementia or pushing you. But right then, it might be those things that might affect a focus. And this is very common. It might affect focus, and by extension, it affects memory. For example, somebody's trying to go to the kitchen to do something, and by the time they get to the kitchen, they forgot why they went there. Usually, if that's a common thing, that's a focus problem. You never put the information, you were in the other room, you thought about what you wanted to do, but you never put it in the file folder and cabinet so that when you come to the kitchen, you just pull it out. As you get older, you get busier, you get more distracted, you have little pains, you have little distractions, you have worries. All these things are affecting the process of putting the information into a folder under your arm to go to the kitchen. And you go to the kitchen, there's nothing in the folder because you are distracted. Beautiful place to start. Identify in your life if there are stressors, if there's sleeplessness, there are medications that affect memory. Is there, anxiety or mild anxiety? All those things affect memory. Now, if that persists for a while, it's good grounds to get checked. Why? Which is the next set of things. B12 deficiency, thyroid disorder, folate, vitamin D, all these things can also, and other metabolic disorders can also affect memory. Now, if it lasts longer, then you worry about degenerative diseases such as vascular disease, Alzheimer's or pre-Alzheimer's, things of that nature. So that's a good runway of thinking of how to approach it.
You just explaining this very beautifully reminded me of when I actually started doing my apprenticeship. There was a coworker of mine which didn't show up for months. And once she showed up again, I asked her like, well, how have you been? Because the kind of like the chief or our boss never disclosed any information like, well, she's just absent due to kind of like a certain disease and so on and so forth. So very vague terms. And she just told me that she had had a burnout. And the symptoms were very similar, to be honest, because how she realized it, although it sounds funny on the surface, I can't even imagine how you feel when you're going through this situation. So she was looking for her car keys and she couldn't find them. And eventually she found them and they were in the fridge. And she didn't know how the keys got actually in the fridge. And then she immediately ran off to the doctor. And the doctor diagnosed her with burnout syndrome. But guessing from the symptoms sounds very similar to the kind of like symptoms you just explained right now that are correlated or associated with dementia or other neurodegenerative diseases.
Absolutely. Like I said, it's the same cognitive domains: memory, focus, attention, executive function, processing speed, how quickly you can process something, right? Visuospatial, how you look at your space, and language. And sometimes people add emotions there. Those 6 or 7 cognitive domains, once you become aware of it, and that's what we do, usually make people aware of it, then you can kind of gauge yourself. Your brain gives you measurements of how you're doing with your most important organ, which is your brain.
Really interesting. And one last thing about diagnosis or what symptoms you should be looking out for. Another question that has come straight to my mind is there a way to know that you are at higher risk with maybe certain biomarkers, apart, of course, from the symptoms that you can feel with, your loss of focus for certain daily things you're doing, maybe like a blood biomarker. Of course, APOE, I guess, is one of those biomarkers that one could test. Would you suggest testing for it at any age, or are there certain kind of like things to look out for?
There was a time that we would tell people not to get it checked because what's the point? There's no treatment, right? But now we'd say that if possible, do check it because now they have found relationship between ApoE4, strong relationship, specifically ApoE4 and dementia. We always knew there was a relationship. We always knew that if you had one gene from one parent, your risk was 4 times. If you had 2 genes, one from each parent, your risk was as much as 12 times. Those numbers are roughly correct. But now we think that even there's more relationship. And more importantly, ApoE4 primarily is related to lipid or fat transport, lipid transport. So that's a clue. People who have ApoE4 should be extra aware of this whole lipid dynamics that we're going to talk about, and it's much more clear now than before. and especially omega-3. It appears that people that have ApoE4 would need extra omega-3, which is the only fat that your brain needs. They're saying that your brain is made of fat, therefore it needs fat. No, that's not true. It makes all the cholesterol it needs. It makes everything else. But omega-3, specifically DHA, yes, that's needed. And DHA is a big part of the brain. More than 50% of the functional fabric of the brain is made of DHA components, or DHA, and it's needed in your diet. And for those that have ApoE4, they have to be extra aware. And sometimes we did a comprehensive review, which was published, which points and kind of pushes towards the fact that you might need supplementation of that particular. Evolution didn't care about you living past 30. So don't bring me Paleolithic logic. It has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the fact that we want to live in our 60s, 70s, 80s and healthfully.
Yeah, but just to add, so that's just one biomarker of
Yes.
figuring out whether we have high risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. There are multiple other ones as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very important for people to know that Alzheimer's disease specifically is a very multifactorial and a multifaceted disease, which means that there are multiple different ways and gateways of individuals experiencing this disease. So, fat metabolism can be, a component of it. We say that basically there are 4 pillars or 4 mechanisms of the development of Alzheimer's disease. It's inflammation, it's oxidation, glucose dysregulation, and lipid dysregulation. There are some other ones too, but these are the main ones that lead to the disease. And not all of them have specific biomarkers. So we're not at a place where we have a perfect formula to say if you test this, and this, then you will have this % higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. So depending on your history, depending on your family history, depending on your risk factors, your environment, even your childhood factors, one can actually formulate an idea of saying, yes, you may be at higher risk or you may be at low risk. So it's important for people to kind of assess their risk as they move along during their lifetime, because it could change depending on multiple factors.
A lot of things that you just mentioned right now are very important for your heart health as well, which we know that diet can have a major impact as well on that. But also like a lot, maybe more genetic components mixed into this as well, which makes it, I guess, very complicated to kind of like diagnose so far in the future, unlike, of course, cardiovascular disease, for example. Now, speaking about preventive measurements, maybe before we go into diet, and I know you mentioned omega-3, so I want to put a pin into that. We will definitely talk about omega-3s here. Exercise. Is there like a specific exercise that has been associated with the best, or not just say the best, but maybe the most decreased risk, or that reduces the risk for dementia or the other kind of like diseases? Is there like a specific exercise?
As much as we both love nutrition and we have a master's in nutrition and she's also a chef and all of that, I'm beginning to realize that exercise is probably the most important factor. Now, that's not lowering the importance of nutrition. It's just raising the importance of exercise. Mm-hmm. Exercise is profoundly important for brain health, probably more than any other organ, because of its effect on BDNF, GDNF, VEGF. These are hormones that grow the connections between neurons, grow the vasculature. So it's not just increasing blood supply to the brain. It's doing so much more. And we know that even what people well in their 70s, they grow their brain. Exercise actually literally grows your brain. Now, what kind of exercise? Both aerobic and anaerobic are important. And aerobic, it's not just a walk next to the water. You got to get tired. I don't mean you have to run. You can do a brisk walk. My thing is brisk walk. Just last night I was on the treadmill, and you got to get tired. You really have to start breathing hard, and quantitatively, it really doesn't matter but you have to push yourself to get tired. So that the reason I use that parameter and not heart rate minus age and all of that stuff. It's your journey, and your journey means if you are a good exerciser and then 10 miles of running becomes like, drinking tea. It's not enough. Then you have to push yourself. So it's critical to push yourself. Then anaerobic, all strengthening seems to be beneficial for the brain, but especially leg strength.
Mhm.
Study after study is now showing that people who have bigger legs, especially when they compare populations, the people that develop leg strength actually develop bigger brains, which is remarkable.
Which talks about the impressive effect of resistance training, specifically in increasing the connections between brain cells.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, one of our favorite studies that we always quote in during our talks is, and this is just one study and has been replicated in multiple different ways in different populations, to study the effect of resistance training in a group of older adults. And it's really fascinating to see the impact of exercise on older adults, because the narrative that we follow right now is, once you're older, once you're 55 and above, it really, you're on the decline and it doesn't really matter. But we now know that even older people can actually literally grow their brain. They can actually improve the connections between brain cells. And so there was a study that was published in 2016, and I'd be happy to send you the citation so that your audience and your listeners can take a look at it. And they wanted to find out the effect of resistance training on a group of older adults who already had mild cognitive impairment. And so mild cognitive impairment is usually a pre-Alzheimer's state. It's when people have memory problems, but not to the extent that it's affecting their daily activities. So they still can do their daily activities, but they do have memory problems. And a lot of these individuals convert to Alzheimer's disease later on. So they were divided into two groups. One of them was exposed to a regimented resistance training program. They exercised 2 to 3 days a week for 6 months, and they did all kinds of resistance training. So back exercises, biceps, triceps, squats, lunges, the whole spiel of building the larger muscles. And out of that group that were exposed to resistance training, nearly 47% of them, so almost half, were basically converted from MCI to normal cognition. They literally reversed
47%.
They reversed their memory problems, and they scored normally in neuropsychological testing. And these results were maintained over a period of 18 months, even though they weren't exposed to the strenuous effects of resistance training. And they found out in that study, which the statement that leg strength matters, in that study, they showed that greater leg strength was extremely effective in improving cognition. And so similar studies have actually shown that when people grow their muscle bulk, they actually have bigger brains. The part of the brain called hippocampus, which is responsible for memory, literally grows in size because of the connections and the dendritic arborization that is created after resistance training.
So this is really fascinating. I knew kind of like the connection between brain health and exercise, but I never knew it to this extent. This is really beautiful, and just goes to show that it's never too late to start exercising.
When we do programs with individuals and communities, the first thing we start with is not nutrition. The first thing we start with is a morning walk, brisk morning walk. A Harvard study showed that people who did 25 minutes of brisk walking, brisk the operative, so you got to get tired, consistently reduce their chance of Alzheimer's by 40%. So here's two simple things: brisk walk, leg strength, 47%, 40%. It's just remarkable that simple things like that. Yet right now, we don't have a single drug, we don't have a single process that reduces Alzheimer's by 1%. But here's simple things like walking and strength training that's been consistently shown to reduce the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's, and it's free. And that's the critical thing: a morning brisk walk.
Amazing. Do we actually know the connection between the leg exercises? Because walking, of course, requires your leg muscles to be involved. And of course, the leg exercises seem to have the biggest impact on the decreased risk. So is there like a connection primarily, or do we know why exactly leg muscles tend to have such a huge decreased risk?
So the hypothesis is that the more you create these growth factors, brain-derived growth factor, BDNF, the more connections you make between the brain cells and neurons. And because our legs have the largest group of muscles, with the least amount of activity, you tend to create more of these incredible growth factors. BDNF is just one of them that has been measured in studies, but there are more. And then the second thought is the vasculature. So, people tend to have better blood circulation or cerebral blood flow when their heart is beating fast. But guess what's a bigger pump than your heart? Your legs. And so when you're active and you're moving your legs, you actually tend to have better circulation as well, which improves movement, which improves the flow, which improves vascular health. And, earlier you were saying that it sounds like the factors for brain health is similar to heart health. And that is absolutely true. It's just that the field of neurology and neuroscience lags about 10 years behind cardiology when it comes to data, showing data that improves it. And obviously, it is an organ with similar vasculature. And so vessel health and vascular health is incredibly important.
There are two factors that are different from brain as opposed to cardiac health. One is hearing loss. Hearing loss is an important factor. We now know that one of the biggest contributors to cognitive decline is hearing loss. And I don't mean hearing loss to the point where you're completely deaf. I'm talking about even subtle hearing loss. If you suspect it or a family member suspect it, get it evaluated. Nowadays, the tools we have are just absolutely remarkable. Now, we had a podcast on hearing loss with professor from Hopkins. The next generation of hearing devices are going to be so good that even people who have significant hearing loss will have better hearing than the rest of us, with directional finding, because it could be on the glasses, giving information directly to the brain. It's incredible. And hearing loss is a factor. Hearing loss does contribute to cognitive decline. The second one, which is extremely important, is cognitive activity. Cognitive activity contributes to your brain health long-term, more than anything. People who challenge their brain actually have resilience. In spite of disease, they can withstand disease. The NUN study showed this, and other studies showed this as well. So those that challenge their brain continuously throughout life, and challenge doesn't mean, PhDs or this or that, around the thing that you have passion in, guitar, dancing, doing podcasts, running companies, doing nonprofits, doing activities that are complex, that involve all parts of your brain, and you push yourself, that grows the connection more than anything else. So those two aspects make the brain much more amenable to survival and change, and it makes it a little different. So those I wanted to talk about because people have control over both of those.
And I'm glad that you actually started talking about music and other activities, because that was actually going to be my next question. Let's just say I'm a patient again, dear Braindocs. I can't bring myself to move my body. I'm a super lazy person. Is there like another thing or another activity that might be more fun for me and more sustainable for me that can also decrease my risk, such as playing piano or, kind of like playing maybe Sudoku or something like that? Are the risk reductions similar to exercise?
Yeah, definitely. Singing music is great. Singing, Aisha's going to now demonstrate the singing part for us.
Oh, please. No, it's not happening.
Okay.
The stage is yours.
The stage is yours. No, but no.
You should bring your guitar and you should play for Luca.
We don't want people to be dropping off the podcast by second. But no, but all activities that challenge your brain, from, like I said, music, learning a new musical instrument, learning new games. I've always been a chess player and I've always played guitar. I'm terrible in both, but I have some time to do it, so I do it. Anything that is around your passion, or you could be around your passion. Take classes. Nowadays, you can take all kinds of classes online.
Oh, yeah.
I'm taking music theory. I'm taking history class. I'm taking philosophy online. Volunteering. All these activities are as good as anything else. And by the way, they're as powerful as exercise. Now imagine, one should not be an exclusion of the other, because the combination is incredibly powerful. With nutrition, we have this NEURO acronym: nutrition, exercise, unwind, stress management, restorative sleep, and optimizing mental activity. Imagine if you optimize all of those, and all of those are free. And all of those can be done in your living room. If you don't like anything and you just love watching TV shows, fantastic. How many patients do I tell this? Watch a show, but now with intention. Have a notepad next to you. After the show, see how much of the detail you can recall. The first 10 times or 20 times, you'll be terrible. But you will see slowly that, oh, my ability to focus and to memorize and recall has really gotten better. And I've done that with 90-year-olds, and they went from recalling 2 things all the way to 30 things by the end of the show. So all of these activities are activities for brain development, your daily life, but you have to make it so that you're focusing, you're pushing yourself, and you're using it as a measure of brain building activity.
For your audience who want to kind of remember these elements, we've created this really self-serving acronym called NEURO because we're neurologists. And these are the elements that have been validated and studied over decades that seem to be associated with better brain health. And when people focus on them, they can reduce the risk of devastating diseases like Alzheimer's and other kinds of dementias and strokes as well. And so NEURO stands for, N is for nutrition, E is for exercise, U is unwind or stress management, R is restorative sleep because sleep is incredibly important, and O is optimizing cognitive activity, which Dean just mentioned, which is essentially real life activities that challenge the brain with complex activities.
Beautiful. I like when you make such complicated interventions. Of course, some of them you mentioned are very quite simple, but a lot that has to do with the brain is very complicated. So I love when you kind of like tune it down for the quote unquote regular folks like me so that we actually can understand it and memorize it. Very simple, because I know when I'm actually learning, I memorize a lot of texts just by looking at acronyms. That's super kind of like effective for me, at least. Again, everybody's different, but neuro is something that I guess all of us can remember after watching this video or listening to it. Yeah. Now, switching gears a little bit and going from all these beautiful activities that one can do that have a powerful impact, let's talk about nutrition. More specifically, I would like to start with, let's just call it the star of attention here in the German-speaking parts of Europe, and that's the nutrient called choline. Now, of course, we cannot talk about choline if we don't mention eggs. Now, there's many studies I've seen and read showing like a really strong association, at least with the methods they use within the study, between brain health and choline. And I would like to hear your thoughts because, of course, you are the experts, you read the studies, so the stage is yours, I guess.
I would like to start by starting a very different way. I mean, this world has become a battlefield of nutrition. It has become a non-scientific religious war almost of plant-based versus meat eaters versus this, and it should be science. Transparency, we're whole food plant-based. We're vegans. For animals, for environment, all of those things. But guess what? When it comes to the science, we are brutally honest and tell you that fish, especially fatty fish, so far has not been found to be bad. At least epidemiologically, that's the evidence. Yeah, do we have belief that maybe we're not checking some of the toxins, maybe the microplastics? That's a separate thing. We go by data. And it's critically important that we do it that way. And we all stand for science, therefore, because then we are basing everything on a groundwork that is agreeable by everyone, which is the scientific method. And that's important. And even on the plant-based side, we say that the only way to live healthy and eat healthy is not 100% plant-based. That's a great way to do it. In fact, you can be very unhealthy and be vegan. It's being mindful of certain things. And to the best of our knowledge today, and that's my favorite scientific statement, to the best of my knowledge today, as scientists, the humility starts there. We start with the null hypothesis. We start by rejecting ourselves. We start by testing to make sure that we find ourselves wrong. at least good science, not some of the new science that big name scientists coming out with papers with horrible way of doing science. But you start by null hypothesis, trying to negate, to falsify yourself. And to that end, eggs, but it's not just eggs, whether it's eggs or yogurt or dairy or fish or other things, we have to talk about it. There's complexity to that. And the complexity with eggs is the data has moved and we're becoming aware that there's a little more complexity. Now, what happens is as soon as the data moves, the sides start either protecting themselves or overstating the facts. And so let's talk about the science. And you've done that work. Sorry, I wanted to do the pre-work for the master, for the maestro.
No.
Yeah.
No.
I think it's an
No, it's
important
very, very
foundation that we
important,
should
yes.
all be basing things on science and the humility. This is how much we know. And we've done, like this year, we're doing 9 reviews. We're in charge of 9 reviews on brain health and different aspects. But we always are very, very circumspect and not humble, but circumspect. At the end of the paper, this is how much we know. This is how much we don't know. And please do not overstate it beyond that.
Well, thank you for asking this question. I think this is probably one of the most confusing aspect of nutrition and brain health, choline specifically. And I think it's a reflection of some of the other nutrients out there as well that we all talk about. The issue is there are some nutrients, that may be important for brain health. But then there are others that may have shown some efficacy or some benefit in mechanistic studies. And then when it is applied in humans, it really is, the results are not as impressive as they are in mechanistic studies. And for your audience, what this essentially means is, there are studies that look at the impact of a nutrient or just, element X, on cells, on animals. And those kind of studies, what they do is everything is really, really controlled. All of the elements, the external elements, the internal elements are controlled. Sometimes these poor little mice are actually given a disease. They're actually artificially injected with things to produce the disease. If you look at the Alzheimer's model of mice, it's just brutal. They basically essentially cause holes in their brains, and then they see how that is associated with element X that they're studying. Regardless, applying all of that information to large populations in humans is what the biggest problem is. And one of the issues that I have with some of the talking heads on internet saying things like, oh, this thing is very good for brain health, but when you look at most of the studies, again, it's either done on petri dishes and on mice, and they haven't really been tested on human beings. So with choline, it's mostly like that too. Yeah, choline is an important element of a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is responsible for transmitting information between brain cells and between the brain and nerves and muscles as well. And so it is used as a messenger in the body. But do we need to focus on eating choline to replace that choline part of acetylcholine? Or specifically from eggs, or can we get it from other foods? That's the biggest question. When you look at studies of eggs, which are one of the biggest sources of choline in our diet, eggs are it's a double-edged sword, right? So in multiple studies, they've shown that when you go over eating eggs, say, for example, if you eat more than 1 or 2 per week, then your risk of disease increases. Your risk of mortality increases. In one study, it actually showed that your risk of cardiovascular disease and heart disease also increases. There was this one other study that recently came out that looked at egg consumption with the risk of Alzheimer's disease in Russian Memory and Aging Project. This was a group of population that have been studied over many years in Chicago Rush University. And they found out that if they ate more than 1 egg a week, they had lower risk of Alzheimer's disease as well. Now, so this is very new. We need to wait for this to be validated. We need to make sure that this is clarified. Whenever a piece of information comes up, we actually have to see whether this is true in multiple different populations as opposed to just 1 or 2 populations before we can make a decision of whether a food is healthy or not really necessary. From other studies, just to kind of present the counterintuitive. From other studies, we have large group of data that when people eat a plant-based diet or a Mediterranean diet that is very high in plants and low in animal products, including eggs, or even vegetarians in Adventist Health Study, they tend to have healthy brains. They tend to have the lowest risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, especially if they take care of specific micronutrients like B vitamins and omega-3s and so on and so forth. Again, it's very, very questionable. I wouldn't jump on the bandwagon. I know that there's a lot of noise on social media about choline and how important it is to take for brain health, but I wouldn't make a decision right now because we already have a lot of data countering the narrative that eggs are important for brain health, and especially the data that came out from the American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association showing that egg consumption can actually increase the risk of heart disease and cardiovascular disease. That is really important. Usually, the brain, whenever people think of the brain, they think of it as this solitary organ, but when you actually denude the brain, all you're left with is blood vessels. It has
the most vascular organ.
It's one of the most vascular organs, and it's estimated that if you put all of these vessels end to end, it spans 400 miles. So just imagine in this skull of ours, we have so many vasculature, and taking care of the endothelium and vascular health is incredibly important. So I would just pause before this narrative actually changes our mind as far as egg consumption is concerned, and just wait for better data to come.
And as I said, we are willing to change with data. The data, for example, one was olive oil. For a long time, we said no oil, zero oil. But the data came back, and we changed our mind that the evidence with olive oil is that a certain quantitatively we have not figured that out, but at least on its own, not even independently, and not even in comparison to bad diet, even in comparison to good diet, olive oil, extra virgin olive oil seems to have benefits, polyphenols and others. So we changed our data, we changed our mind on that. With eggs, we're not there yet. The data has not been repeated significantly, has not been repeated in different kind of populations and different studies. And that's what we want for people to kind of start living their life around. Now, if you want to live in reactionary, then you're going to be jumping all over the place with social media. Every day there's something else coming up. Let me give you an example. When it came to mice, not even petri dish, a living being, 400 foods and drugs worked on mice and Alzheimer's. Yeah. 400. How many of those translated to humans? 0.
Yeah.
So everything you see on internet is either a petri dish study that people talk about, or a mouse study, or one-off human study with 20 people in it. We really need to make sure that we do robust studies and then reproduce it by a third group, another group that has no links, and then you have confidence. Mm-hmm. And then you keep building on that confidence. Yeah. So that's the thinking process that I think is most valuable.
And just to add to it, right now, we actually don't have a recommended dietary allowance for choline. We actually don't know how much is actually necessary for brain health. And most of the studies that have actually looked at choline deficiency comes from disease states, not in, individuals who are walking and talking to you. They actually come from studies of people who have, say, for example, things like fatty liver disease or some sort of an inflammatory bowel disease or chronic kidney disease. We can't really apply information that come from disease states to general population. And then the second point is eggs are not the only source of choline. There are a lot of healthier foods that actually have choline in them too. Wheat germ, quinoa, lots of beans, soy products have some choline in them as well. And we know that those are incredible. Those are incredible sources of fiber and so many other nutrients as well. So I would tell your lovely audience not to worry about all of this noise on social media and just wait for good data to come. And until then, let's just eat some oatmeal and quinoa and just chill,
But the 3 micronutrients that you should be aware of, and it has been validated, and even just to impugn us plant-based people even further, is B12. In America, about 41% of population, not just plant-based, 41% of population is B12 deficient. more than 40%, let's just say, because that's one. But especially plant-based people, B12, be aware of it, take it if you need to. That's basically it, and that's okay. We're not against supplementation. Who said that? That's the naturalistic bias is by definition a bias. It's a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. The next one is vitamin D. We live in California, and the number of people in the sunny California that are vitamin D deficient is bewildering. And importance of vitamin D is profound in brain health, neural health, everything. And then omega-3. Absolutely. Don't just be magical. Don't just listen to the talking heads. If you have to check your levels, and of course the insurance doesn't cover it, check your levels. We did, and if you need to supplement. Again, I say there's nothing wrong with medication in the right context. There's nothing wrong with supplementation in the right context. Those are the three, though. What happens with supplementation, all of a sudden, door opens up with patients coming with bags of supplements, because that's a great way that clinics can sell things to people, right? So, but the three that are critical are those three.
Beautifully explained. Thank you so much. And before we start talking about omega-3s, because this is another nutrient which is really important and is strongly associated with brain health, let's just circle back to choline. Because from what I've read, the strongest associations are within pregnant women and choline intake, I guess. What would you say to the data about pregnancy and choline intake? Would you suggest for a pregnant woman to take choline supplements if they don't want to maybe eat eggs? Or what would your recommendation be?
Again, I don't think that, the data is very clear on that. Yes, the body needs more choline. The body of a pregnant woman needs more choline than an average adult who's not carrying a child. If I'm not mistaken, most supplements for pregnant women contain some choline in it. And this is something that has been studied over a long period of time. And if they are taking their pregnancy supplements, the multivitamin, I think they should be fine. Again, there is no particular evidence-based guideline suggesting that pregnant women should take choline supplementation. We have to be really cautious about taking supplements too. We think that, it's absolutely fine, but a lot of them actually could activate mechanisms that are dormant in our body. And we don't want, some of those harmful mechanisms to get activated with these kind of supplements. So no, I wouldn't suggest it unless someone has a particular condition where their healthcare provider is suggesting them to take it, then they should follow their physician or their healthcare provider's recommendations and do so. But, for the general population, there really isn't any concern so far.
I love the fact that you're sticking to this, because it's actually a good place to talk about how we should think about these things. The validity of data is actually pushed by the importance of the underlying factor, which is acetylcholine and choline and brain development of the baby, infant inside, a pregnant woman. That association is evident to us. We know it. There's a sense of urgency. How could the most important neurotransmitter, or it's one of the more important neurotransmitters, what if? It's a what if thing. It's a philosophical concept more than a scientific concept. So that is valid. A mother was worried about the neural development of their child. Is there data that a quantity of acetylcholine, which we haven't, or choline, which is that was deficient in a group caused X, Y, or Z? Is there valid data? No, not strong valid data. Because by saying that, we would actually assume that we know what the right quantity of choline is. And as we said, ironically, we haven't even figured that out. So you can see that there's a worry, an emotional issue, valid emotional issue, and the connection to choline is real, but we don't know how to quantify it. So what, like usual as human beings, we say, I might as well, what if, and might as well. And if that's the case, I tell people, I'm going to jump here a little bit. I say, if you're worried and you think that, yeah, go ahead. But scientifically, I can't say that there's enough data to mitigate your fear or promote the science. Those two things are important. There isn't enough data. But if you think that that association is strong enough for you, absolutely, at least for that period of time, you can take choline supplements. You can take eggs if you want, but don't overdo it, because we don't even know where the quantity lies. So I'm worried. I just wanted to kind of lay out the psychology as opposed to what the real science is, and that distinction actually sometimes crosses over.
Really important points, and I love that you brought up this argument, because because we look at the single nutrient, and if we single out this nutrient, for example vitamin E, in prospective cohort studies, vitamin E is of course packed within healthy plant fat sources, and it's associated with, of course, a decreased risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, if researchers want to single out and extract vitamin E, put it in a pill form, runs on randomized controlled clinical trials, we don't see that kind of effect, usually. So that's why I love that you brought up this argument, and also about the mechanistic data that you brought up a little bit earlier. It's super important that we don't hyper-focus on mechanistic data. It's great for us to help us understand certain mechanisms when we have the health outcomes to back that up. I always come back to exercise. If I were to come to your lab right after exercise, what would we see? I guess hypertension, high blood sugar, high inflammation markers. And just looking at those kind of symptoms or those kind of like biomarkers, you would probably suggest me to stop working out just by looking at those things. But of course, hopefully everybody listening and watching to this knows that's nonsense. So I love that you brought up that it's not as simple as it usually sounds, or as these influencers make it sound to be.
I love you brought that up. So being a physician, I have some connection. So we did a thorough cardiac workup for me. And actually, I'm kind of ashamed that I didn't know that during exercise, your blood pressure goes up so high. Remember, I always said that I think that a blood pressure of 170 is not normal under any circumstances. Yeah. My blood pressure went up to 170, and the cardiologist said, actually, this is not only normal, this is actually subnormal. So let's take that. Why is there no argument against exercise? And there's argument against eating, healthier plants versus this or that. The evidence against Alzheimer's is significant. I mean, if you look at it that way, mechanistically, there's severe vasoconstriction, which is always seen as bad.
In an exercise.
And that's yes. Post-exercise. There's inflammation, significant inflammation. There's oxidative processes. Your metabolism goes awry. Your body goes into fight or flight. Your blood pressure goes up to 170 and above. We should all stop exercising.
Yeah.
Because that's not how we look at things. We look at the mechanism, we look at the acute, we look at the long term, then we reproduce it, and then we have some measure of confidence. Yet, yes, long term, there's a relation between this and this and this. With choline, let's take the first point. With anything, can you measure the thing? If you can't measure the thing, it's not a thing. What's the appropriate measurement of choline? Conversation stopped. Let alone second level, third level, fourth level, fifth level, and long-term study. None of that exists. So my point is not so much to fight eggs. I don't care. Even from an ethical basis, there's some argument. Some people make that eggs are fine because it's not even a point of argument. The point is the data is not there. The previous data to this point, especially cardiovascular data, had shown significant correlation with negative outcomes. And if that changes, the number one factor in science that we should live with is that be comfortable with change. If you're not comfortable with change, you're going to be more uncomfortable with irrelevance. So, but the data has to be supported. First, define your terms. Can't define your terms, you're not in the game. What is the normal level of choline? Don't bring me pediatric ICU data as your measure of choline. That's not right. For example, when people use ketogenic diet, they say it was used in certain diseases. Yes, chemotherapy is used in cancer, but we don't use chemotherapy in normal, non-cancer individuals. The state, the condition, the progression, the baseline, all of that is so significant to look at. Now, for general public, that becomes problematic because people use little data here to support their beliefs and a little data here. But I think if you start finding people like you, Luca, who stand for science and the language of science, and they even hold themselves accountable to that language of science, then that's a good place to start, that this is not a camp. There is no camp. We don't belong to a camp. We belong to the camp that continually changes with data.
And I love what you said right here, basically, because this is so important. Looking at the totality of evidence is something that we all need to do. And we also need to be humble enough to realize that, hey, this is not my domain.
Yeah.
Yes, you can analyze the data. Absolutely. But I received, because choline has been the center of attention in the German speaking part of Europe, quite a lot of people concerned about choline that are plant based. And I told them, like, look, this is not my domain. I've analyzed the data myself, so take it with a huge grain of salt, and I don't make any recommendations. But from what I've seen, as with every nutrient, we should look at the health outcomes. For example, Health at 20 study, number 2, 10,000 of vegans. They do really well, and they probably don't eat a lot of choline. Yeah, we can talk about another nutrients which might be a little bit concerning for vegans, and that's omega-3, but it doesn't seem to be choline. At least that's not what the research suggests. It's great to analyze the data, but if you start analyzing, you have to also be humble enough to tell people, well, I don't know. I made a video recently about salt intake and the confusion with salt. And that what we usually see in a lot of studies is a U-shaped curve. U-shaped referring basically to the fact that at the lowest intake, we see an increased risk for mortality. Then the mortality risk drops in the middle. And as the dose increases, we see an increased risk. But when you analyze the data of all the meta-analyses that basically created this U-shaped curve, you can see something that is a little bit concerning, because all they included were studies that did measure the sodium intake either with a food frequency questionnaire, which that's not what the food frequency questionnaire set out to do, or they did a 24-hour urinary test, just once, which is honestly not a very good measurement as well. You want to do multiple. And if you look at study that included multiple and only looked at multiple 24-hour urinary tests, or study that included those multiple tests, we can see a linear relationship. And that's something that it's really hard to look out for if you don't understand what you actually need to look out for. Same as with saturated fats, same as with eggs, and so on and so forth. I mean, with eggs, most studies and the most well-designed studies show that up to 1 egg seems to be probably fine. But even then, if you look at some of the studies, they adjusted for cholesterol, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Why are you adjusting for the thing that eggs are known for or notorious for? Let's just put it that way. So
one of the things when we did research is that it's over control. When you control for the very factor that's the confound, it's not a confounder, it's a central factor, then you've over controlled. It's a beautiful state. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been so insightful, and I learned so much just from this 1-hour podcast and just from 1 hour talking to both of you. Again, I have my deepest respect for both of you, and it's an honor to sit virtually in front of you. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Now we have to cut it off right here. We will talk about and pick it right up where we kind of like want to talk about and highlight omega-3, what we need to look out for, what's the optimal dose, and so on and so forth. So we will definitely do a part 2 in the near future. So thank you very much. But before I let you go, why don't you tell the audience where they can find you? Well, they probably already know. And of course, about your work, any exciting project that you would like to highlight. And of course, please talk about your amazing podcast.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you so much for having us, Luca. Speaking with you always is such a pleasure. And we so appreciate everything you're doing for science, for your lovely audience, and making sure that the conversation stays evidence-based. We truly appreciate that. Looking forward to speaking with you again. Our lovely listeners and the audience can find us on social media. We're pretty active. We're known as the Braindocs. Our website is thebraindocs.com. And our podcast, we're very proud of it, is called Your Brain On. And yeah, give it a listen and let us know. We're very open for feedback and communication with everyone to know what they're interested in and what topics we should discuss in the future.
And the project that we're most proud of is our non-for-profit Healthy Minds Initiative. That's also in social media. Healthy Minds Initiative, where we're doing community-based brain health initiatives in communities where they suffer the most from these ailments, dementia, stroke, and other brain diseases. And we're instituting a research protocol to see the effect of lifestyle at the community level where it matters. So if you want to support us, we're so proud of that. Most of what we do goes into that. So yeah, we'd love to have you guys part of all that effort.
Amazing. And of course, I would also both of you to highlight the Neuro Academy. Would you mind maybe sharing a couple of words what that's about?
Absolutely. So Neuro Academy is a community, an online community that started off as a Facebook group, but then it's growing tremendously. And it's a group of individuals in a community that essentially are on a journey towards their brain health. And it's an online platform where we share elements of research, conversations about brain health, about the elements that we talked about: nutrition, exercise, stress, sleep, and optimization of cognitive activity, and on-demand courses. And we did that because the learning technique so far about health and wellness has been essentially a short content or a brochure, but we wanted people to actually live in a community supporting each other. So you can find more about it on neuroacademy.com.
And again, I cannot say this enough. Thank you so, so much for everything you do. And I'm sure many of other thousands of people would agree with the statement that you are both such a gift to not only science, but to humanity in general. So thank you very
Very kind
much.
of you.
Thank you so much.
That's
Thank
very
you.
kind of you, Luca. Thank you so much.